Good morning and welcome to Community Church, and welcome to our final organ and poetry extravaganza. You're sad, I heard you're sad, and I can hear the sighs of you at home as well. Thank you for being with us through this Lenten journey. It's hard to believe that Holy Week is next week. And so, as I always say, welcome. I'm Andrew Galuska, the Director of Music and Fine Arts here at the Community Church, and we are happy that you have joined us. We ask that you put your mind at ease, that you leave what belongs outside of these walls, outside, that you be present in this moment of spoken word and music. And again, thank you for being with us. I'd like to introduce Sean Sexton, who then will introduce our poet. Sean.
Good morning. We are fortunate to conclude our series with a wonderful writer. We could have never arranged this had not all these different things come together. Rumina Bujarovska. I think I said that really well. I did. She's from Macedonia, and she's been on a little tour, mini tour, of the South, I think is right to say. She's interested in Flannery O'Connor and getting Flannery O'Connor into the Balkans. Is that a correct way to say that? And to translate her. And so Steve, her translator, and my dear friend and an alumnus of this series, Steve Bradbury, is here as well. And they drove up to visit Alice Fryman, who came and did a concert on Holocaust Memorial Day one time, quite a while ago. And she was at our Poetry and Barbecue. And anyway, I could just go on all day. But what I want to tell you, Rumina Bujarovska, 1981 Skopje, North Macedonia, is a fiction writer, literary translator, and social commentator, author of 4 volumes of short stories, translated into more than 10 languages. Her book, My Husband, Dalkey Archive Press, has received critical acclaim in Europe and has been adapted into several stage productions. She is a professor at the State University in Skopje and runs a women's storytelling initiative entitled Preach, Preach. And why don't I tell you about Steve just very briefly too. He's an artist, had a great show at the Center for Spiritual Care last time around, and he's an artist, writer, and translator. His translation of Amangs Raised by Wolves, poems and conversations, and also drawings of his in the volume, won the 2021 PEN Award for Poetry and Translation. Big prize, a big one. And anyway, he has helped Rumina with her translation, although you will see she speaks beautiful English. And so I give you Rumina. And incidentally, her books are here. She has some books here too.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I'm always thrilled that there's an audience present and that you're actually giving me the time to listen to me read, and also I'm fascinated that I'll have someone like Andrew then interpreting the things that I read. Thank you, Sean, so much for inviting me, and thank you, Steve, for making this possible. Steve is my translator. We met in Iowa in 2018. Steve does not speak Macedonian, which is my mother language, but I translated into English, and then Steve and I worked on it together. And he really helped me learn the craft of translation. So thank you, Steve. And once again, thank you very much for having me also kind of close these series. I've heard about them, I've watched them. Actually, I've watched the live stream, and the space is also amazing. So thank you once again. So what I'm going to do today is I'll read several pieces. I am actually not a poet. So I write short stories and I translate. And I think translation is a very important skill. And I think literary translators don't really get noticed for the things that they do. So I'm going to start with, I will read some poetry, and which is not mine, because I was told that I can do that too. It's in context of the things that I've prepared today. The first thing that I will read is a section of Alice in Wonderland, because I translated Alice in Wonderland into Macedonian. And just so that you know, Macedonian is a small, well, we call those minor languages, which means that they're not spoken by that many people. So North Macedonia, we had to change our name because of a dispute with Greece into North in Macedonia, before we were just Macedonia, was part of Yugoslavia. So we're a predominantly Slavic population, and our language is called Macedonian, and it's Slavic. So it more resembles what you might know as Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, or even Russian, if you would like, Ukrainian. They're all in the same group. So what I'm going to do today is I'll read this humorous poem from Alice in Wonderland. It's in the section with the caterpillar. Most of Alice in Wonderland is basically because Alice is sort of, she's dreaming, so she's constantly getting all these didactic poems wrong. And a lot of the poems in the actual text are parodies of existing ones that people have forgotten because Alice became more popular. So what I'm going to do, it was a very big challenge to translate Alice into Macedonian, specifically because also the rhythm of the Macedonian language is different. So, but you'll see, I'm very proud of what I did, actually. So I'm not being very humble right now, but I thought, I can't do this. And then I thought, well, people actually built rockets and went to the moon. So if they could do that, I'm sure I can just translate Alice in Wonderland. So it took a while. So I'm going to read Your Old Father William, and then I'll read the first stanza also in Macedonian, and then I'll also read the last stanza in Macedonian so that you can hear the rhythm and the language so that you know what it sounds like. Wait, I have to find the Macedonian version, just a sec. All right. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white. And yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? And now the Macedonian. Ti si star, tatko William, sinot mlad reče, I целиот си в косите сед. Сепак, весь ден на глава ти стоиш. Мислиш ли тоа е вред? In my youth, Father William replied to his son, I feared it might injure the brain. But now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again. You are old, said the youth, as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? In my youth, said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple. You are old, said the youth, and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it? In my youth, said the father, I took to the law and argued each case with my wife. And the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life. You are old, said the youth, one would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever? I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough, said the father. Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen to all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. And the Macedonian final version. Final stanza. 3 прашања праша, не може веќе, таткото луто создаде. Ти важен се правиш, што ти е тебе, мрш или клоца ке јадеш? Go. Well, I'm pretty sure we have a soundtrack for Alice in Wonderland. Okay, where's my book? So, the last book that I wrote is called I'm Not Going Anywhere, and it thematizes the desire to emigrate and to leave the place where you're from because you don't think it's good enough for you. I didn't really thematize economic migration because, or any other type. But what I did talk about in this book was just something that is very common, I think, in a lot of Balkan countries and probably in a lot of Eastern European countries and a lot of third world countries where people think that life is elsewhere. And because of that, there seems to be a kind of paralysis of their mind and their will, so they don't invest in changing their lives. They don't invest in doing anything. All they desire to do is just leave, even when their life is pretty good. And that's something that this is the theme of the book, is that the short stories are somehow based on these people being unhappy with their lives and wanting to immigrate normally to the States or to Australia or to Germany, the countries that do well economically. Or they also thematize the idea of inferiority that a lot of people from the Balkans have towards Westerners. But when I wrote this book, I had a poem by the Greek poet Kavafi. Konstantinos Kavafis is his name, and he's a poet at the turn of the 20th century who lived most of the time in Alexandria. But he's famous for the poem Waiting for the Barbarians. If you've not read that poem, I strongly suggest that you do, because then the Nobel Prize winner John Coetzee wrote a book called Waiting for the Barbarians, which I think received the Booker Prize. It's one of the best books I've ever read. So what I'm going to do, yes, I have to divulge that I am half Greek, so I speak Greek, and it's been a very big problem, I think, because Macedonians and Greeks don't like each other a lot, to put it mildly. But this is the inscription. I open with a quote from this particular poem, and it's very different from the Alice poem. So first I'll read it in English, and then I'll read it in Greek so that you can hear perhaps the sound of the language. The poem is called The City. You said, I'll go to another country, go to another shore, find another city better than this one. Whatever I try to do is fated to turn out wrong, and my heart lies buried like something dead. How long can I let my mind molder in this place? Wherever I turn, wherever I look, I see the black ruins of my life. Here, where I've spent so many years, wasted them, destroyed them totally. You won't find a new country, won't find another shore. This city will always pursue you. You'll walk the same streets, grow old in the same neighborhoods, turn gray in these same houses. You'll always end up in this city. Don't hope for things elsewhere. There's no ship for you. There's no road. Now that you've wasted your life here in this small corner, you've destroyed it everywhere in the world. And the translation is by Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard. And now I'll read the Greek version. Η πόλης. Είπες, θα πάω σε άλλη γη, θα πάω σε άλλη θάλασσα. Μια πόλη άλλη θα βρεθεί καλύτερη από αυτή. Κάθε προσπάθειά μου μια καταδίκη είναι γραφτή κι είναι η καρδιά μου σαν νεκρός θα μένει. Ο νους μου ως πότε μες των μαρασμών αυτός θα μένει. Όπου το μάτι μου γυρίσω, όπου και αν δω, ερείπια μαύρα της ζωής μου βλέπω εδώ, που τόσα χρόνια πέρασα και ρήμαξα και χάλασα. Καινούριους τόπους δεν θα βρεις. Δεν θα βρεις άλλες θάλασσες. Η πόλη θα σε ακολουθεί. Στους δρόμους θα γυρνάς τους ίδιους και στις γειτονιές τις ίδιες θα γερνάς και μες στα ίδια σπίτια αυτά θα σπρίζεις. Πάντα στην πόλη αυτή θα φτάνεις. Για τα αλλού Μη ελπίζεις. Δεν έχει πλοίο για σε, δεν έχει οδό. Έτσι που τη ζωή σου ρήμαξας εδώ στην κόχη τούτη τη μικρή, σε όλη την γη την χάλασας. That was absolutely wonderful. I promise to move on to more cheerful topics. So, all right. I'm going to read now from my book, which is based on this dreary subject of people who are paralyzed and in terms of not wanting to change their lives or thinking that their lives are elsewhere. And of people who, even though they've immigrated, they just don't feel right in that new environment. So the story that I'm going to read, the first section of, there are some books available, by the way. Steve will have them later if anyone wants to buy one later. We don't have many, though. Another thing is this book, this particular story, something that you might not understand is when they talk to each other, there's this one section where the narrator says, our language. So this is something that in Yugoslavia, we say about the language that was called Serbo-Croatian, but then, you're not supposed to say that, but it's one language. So it used to be known as Serbo-Croatian nationalists don't like it when you say it's the same language. It is absolutely the same language. So it was called Serbo-Croatian, and they were like, oh, well, then Bosnian is not in it, and Montenegrin is not in it, and then so now there's Croatian, there's Bosnian, there's Montenegrin, and there's, what's the first? Serbian. And my books have been translated into all of those languages. It's the same language, and it's sometimes the same translation. I can claim that I speak 17 languages because of this. So what normal people do is they'll just call it, instead of calling it BCSCM or whatever, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Montenegrin, they'll just sometimes say our language. Can we speak in our language, they say, and we're like, oh, okay, but it's not my language. Our language is their language to them. I speak Macedonian, but I also speak Serbo-Croatian. It's just that it was the official language of Yugoslavia, it broke up when I was a kid, but I had to learn the language, so now I speak that one. But it's not, for us, it's not our language, though they think that we should all speak it. So when I say our language, it means Serbo-Croatian in the book, and then my language would be Macedonian. All right, the story is called Medusa, and I'll just read the beginning of it. My stories are long, so that's why. Sophia has a few things going for her. She's a great host, for example, and she's also an amazing geologist, but everyone knows that. That's about it. She and her husband, Ivan, live in Meadowview, the suburb with all the rich people. Ivan used to be in academia, but never really tried to outshine his wife's success. He has a PhD in archaeology. We're both into the earth, Sophia had chirped when we first met. He's a Capricorn and I'm a Virgo, ha ha. I wasn't sure what she was trying to tell me. Earth signs, she explained. Ivan is one of the co-owners of a company for dental implants run by his family, hence the palatial home in Meadowview. Sophia and Ivan have 2 children, as do we, except ours are younger and are girls. That evening, our daughters were watching as Simon, that's my husband, and I were getting ready for Ivan and Sophia's Boogie Nights theme party in Meadowview. I'd gone so far as to order a pair of vintage roller skates, but I didn't dare wear them in front of the girls. They were already screaming anyhow, refusing to give us back our wigs. Mine was a blonde, bushy afro, and Simon's an Austin Powers knockoff. In his white bodysuit, a button to the navel, he was supposed to look like a pimp, but he wasn't terribly convincing. Looking at ourselves in the mirror, we both felt a bit disappointed, but refused to admit it. We look groovy, we lied to each other. We're so rad, we egged each other on. You're my Professor Pimp, I teased him, though in truth, the way his spidery black chest hair stood out against his pale skin struck me as somehow distasteful. Another problem was that my costume, a short floral dress with bell sleeves, had turned out much too revealing. I consoled myself that my legs would look longer and not as lumpy once I put on the roller skates. Knowing we'd be drinking, we called a cab. Our daughter's screaming finally faded out of earshot as we shut the doors to the taxi. 154 Meadowview, please, I told the cabbie, conscious of the cachet of that address. Just saying it made me feel more important and dignified than usual, though I would have been ashamed to admit it in public. I understood why Sophia and Ivan lived there, to appear to be well-heeled and famous. They didn't have the millions they'd have needed to afford a house in the heart of this neighborhood, so they'd settled on the very edge, over a gully, and with an expansive view of the busy road with its constant drone and exhaust fumes directly below. Their home was undoubtedly a mansion all the same. Maybe that's why their 2 sons never made an appearance at their parents' parties. Probably they were locked up in one of the many chambers of the family palace, perhaps in one of the several living rooms or down in the basement that had been converted into a cinema. Or maybe they just never made an appearance because they were teenagers. But there were times when one of them would creep soundlessly into the kitchen like a ghost and snatch something out of the fridge. "Is that Mark?" Sophia would call out. The boys have English names, by the way. "No, I think it's George." "George! Georgie! Georgie!" She'd bawl if she was already tipsy. But neither Mark nor Georgie ever said hello. Ivan's origins are from Rijeka, that's in Croatia, though he might be Serbian. Most probably he's mixed, just like everyone else. He says he's Yugoslav and insists on speaking our language with us, even though Simon and I don't consider that language to be really ours. Sofia's origins, meanwhile, are more mysterious. She says she was born in Belgrade, but she's definitely not from there. I know this because she can't speak our language and keeps switching to English, though she probably catches on when we're talking with Ivan, and I can tell she can understand what we're saying when Simon and I are having a conversation. Her favorite dish is a fried, oily, onion-laden minced meat dish we call köfte, and she calls a meatball. She sometimes boasts of having an exotic past and of having resided in several Balkan cities. She might be a refugee, who knows? One of her common complaints was, "I'm sick and tired of being asked where I'm from," adding, "It's downright racist." "We're all from somewhere," I heard her say once. Everyone around her nodded with compassion. "What's it to you where my accent's from anyhow?" "But sometimes it's just a way for people to get to know each other," I replied. "They learn things about each other's history, culture, stuff like that. Hardly a bad way to start a conversation, don't you think?" This was something I confronted her about back then, though after several years living in England, I must confess I've started leaning toward her opinion. She'd look straight through me, though, not even bothering to respond. The truth is, she'd only started giving me the time of day after it dawned on her I was Simon's wife. Also, since she found out that I was a published author, literary theory, sounds fancy, she tittered, she hasn't turned her back on me quite so much. And that's going to be the end of this chapter. That's exactly how I feel about my story. So, I think this might be my last piece. It's the longest one and the raunchiest one. So, I wrote a book called My Husband, and that's the hit book. It was before this one. I didn't translate that one with Steve. So this story that I'm actually reading is a translation of the Iowa Writers' Workshop where Steve and I actually met, but it's translated by a Bulgarian woman, and Bulgarians and Macedonians also have a lot of beef. So I'm kind of happy that we don't, me and Ekaterina. So the book is about what I wrote the book because I initially wrote this story, which is called My Husband the Poet. And it was in a burst of frustration. Why? Because I had been working at a poetry festival in this town of Struga in Macedonia, which is by the Lake of Ohrid. And it houses it's a huge poetry festival, and we've had a lot of important poet laureates like Ginsberg and Ted Hughes and Carol Ann Duffy and Seamus Heaney, people like that. But also, so I worked there as a volunteer, and I was very much subjected to a lot of bad poetry too, especially by a lot of local poets who were very boring. And and they just loved to subject us to their stuff. But mostly they were just writing, they were really bad. And so, but I didn't know how to respond to that at the time. I was just kind of afraid to be like, oh, I don't want to listen to this. So I had to really listen. And there was good poetry, but there was also, as I said, a lot of bad poetry. So what happened was, just in this, I had some friends who were sending me poetry, and very frequently it was just about nothing. It was just about how they were writing poetry all the time. So one moment, I just burst out. I wrote this story I thought, what would it be like to be married to such a bad poet? So I wrote that story, and then I wrote all the other stories in the book are all written from the perspective of a woman who's married unhappily to someone, and my initial thing was that it would be my husband the ambassador, my husband the businessman, I don't know, my husband this and that, because I wanted to highlight how women are normally not identified by their professions. They're identified by their marital status and their family status, but men are always identified by their profession, and women are pretty much absent from a lot of canonical literature. And I thought, well, this is a great way to give them a voice, and also to show that women are not perfect. They're, also humans. So I wrote this story, and it's about the poet. This is how it started, my book. All right. My Husband the Poet. Let's see. I first met Goran at a poetry festival. His hair had already started to turn gray. It's totally white now, and I think he's convinced it contributes to his new sex appeal, as he calls it. He says it as a joke, but I know he actually means it. I'm tempted to ask if his thinning hair and his lumpy scalp, which has the pallor and sheen of hardened wax, also constitute this new sex appeal, but I hold back. He doesn't do well with criticism. He quickly gets angry, and when he's angry, he becomes mean. This lasts for days, and the only way I can get him to stop being unbearable is by doing something self-abasing, like accidentally reciting a verse from one of his poems. The other day, he got really pissed at me when I refused to read the poems he'd written the night before. I don't have time now. How about tomorrow? I told him. You really don't have time for 3 poems? His voice sounded irritated, and I regretted turning him down right away. But it was too late. From now on, he'd take anything I said the wrong way. So I kept quiet. Fine, then go study up for your little lessons, he said, slamming the door. He tells me to go study up whenever I'm prepping to teach. What he's trying to imply is that if I really knew history like I should, I wouldn't have to prepare for class. You either know it or you don't, he once told me, and glared at me in contempt. As far as his poetry goes, I really don't want to read any of it, let alone be forced to listen to it. He used to subject me to that torture, too. Back when we were still in love and before we had kids, we'd make love and he'd whisper poems in my ear as we lay there afterwards, all sweaty and out of breath. His poems invariably mentioned flowers of some kind of other, especially orchids, because they reminded him of pussies, or southerly winds, or the sea. And there were frequent references to exotic spices and materials like cinnamon and velvet. Something along the lines that I tasted like cinnamon, my skin felt like velvet, for example, or that my hair smelled like the sea, which I know was a lie because my mother had once told me that my hair reeked. And yet, in those moments, his words used to really turn me on. I'd get excited and want to make love to him again, even though he often couldn't do it right away. So I'd repeat these images and his words to myself and get turned on. He doesn't do that anymore, thank God. I find his poetry so off-putting that I don't want to read a single verse of it, let alone have to listen to him recite it. Sadly, though, I still have to. As I already said, Goran gets really mad if I refuse, and I want to spare both myself and the kids these fights. Now that we don't make love as often, he started reading his poems aloud to me instead of letting me read them on my own. It was during one of those instances, as I watched him standing in the middle of the living room under the bright ceiling lamp, which emphasized his bulbous nose and his ashy complexion, that it slowly started to dawn on me that his poetry really isn't very good. It's often about nothing more than him and how he writes poetry. I think that seriously turns him on, literally. Here's an example. The scent she carries is like autumn, dissolving like drops of rain in her eyes. The words make this poem mine. Maybe this isn't the best example, but it's the only one I know by heart because I sometimes happen to accidentally recite the last 3 lines. The words make this poem mine, in an effort to get him to stop being mad at me. I hum them, rather, which especially strokes his ego since he's always wanted a musician to put his poetry to music. What he doesn't realize is that this would be impossible. His poems have no rhythm and often make no sense either. They're just series of empty words carelessly strung together into verses so that the uninitiated might spot some exotic term like cinnamon or velvet and come to the conclusion that his poetry really is something special. That's what I used to think too, back when I was still young and stupid and fell for such tricks. God, was I stupid. It really is incredible. I just can't forgive myself for it. Anyway, I was talking about how we first met. As I already mentioned, it was at a poetry festival. I was there working as a translator, something I used to do to make money before I started teaching history. One evening, in the lobby of the big hotel where the poets and translators were staying, we all gathered together and sang folk songs. I now realize that the poets were trying to show off by making themselves seem like sensitive souls who did not merely write poetry, but also appreciated traditional music. They had a musical ear, and they could sing. That was when our Goran appeared. In keeping with the theme of the evening, he wore a white shirt embroidered with traditional folk motifs. I have to admit he did really look good in it. Goran, after all, was very handsome. Now that I think about it, that was what made me fall in love with him. His chest was like an exquisitely shaped sculpture, and his shoulders and arms were so strong and hairy that looking at them made you wish he'd hold you forever, never let you go, and carry you off somewhere. Anyway, Goran didn't sit with everyone else, but stood a little apart, leaned against a wall with his head tilted to the side, and observed the group. Seizing the moment when everyone had quieted down, he suddenly straightened up and started singing a folk song. I'm pretty sure it was More Sokol Pije. As I eventually found out, that's the only folk song he actually knows. With his theatrical hollering, his eyes closed, his head thrown back, and his Adam's apple bobbing up and down, he looked like a crowing rooster. I found him ridiculous, but at the same time, I couldn't stop looking at his arms and his chest, imagining him seizing hold of me. When he was done singing, people applauded, and he looked in my direction. His eyes were a little teary, probably from all that crowing and the exertion. But back then, I thought they were full of sorrow. I felt an urge to console him. Later that evening, I did console him in his room, and that's how the whole thing started. He's still going to poetry festivals all the time. He goes whenever his work allows it, which, by the way, he's lousy at. I can only imagine how he behaves at these poetry festivals. First of all, he brings along half a suitcase of his thin little poetry books with their cheap laminated covers. He's had most of them translated into English and into several of the Balkan languages so that foreigners might also be able to grasp his meaningless blabberings. The language I speak doesn't interest him, which is why, as if by miracle, he's never asked me to translate his stuff. But he also thinks I'm no good at poetry, that I don't get it, since I've shown little interest in his endeavors lately. The translations of his poems, though, are terrible. Not just in terms of content. His poems are already void of any content, as they are, but they're riddled with grammatical mistakes, too. That's because he's cheap. He wants to have his poems translated, but doesn't want to pay. Instead, he always manages to find some pitiful young girls that he sweeps off their feet with his mature sex appeal and gets them to translate his poems either for free or for a miserable fee. I've overheard his haggling with them before, offering 10 copies of his new book as compensation for their labor. I find that utterly embarrassing, but what can I do? Every time he comes back from his poetry festivals, he shows me the pictures on his digital camera. He usually gives the camera to somebody and asks them to take pictures of him. So there are lots of pictures of him reciting poetry at a podium, behind a microphone, with one of his ugly little books in his hand. His poetic expression is captured in all these pictures. I tell him this openly since for some reason it seems to flatter him. His eyebrows are slightly raised, but one's higher than the other, as if he were concerned and at the same time moved. His chest is sticking out. His hair is always freshly washed, usually blowing in the springtime breeze of the little coastal towns whose festivals he especially likes to frequent. The other pictures are usually of women. Actually, there are rarely any men in them. I'm not worried about the girls who volunteer for the festivals. I don't think they'd be into him, since he's too old and ridiculous for them. I think he currently poses more of a temptation to a different category of women, those dignified middle-aged ladies, a little on the chubby side, with rolls of fat around their waists and underneath their armpits, with their bras cut into their flesh. They like to dress in tight red or black tops. Their hair is usually black, and they wear red lipstick. Not infrequently, they don dramatic hats on their heads. Chunky, shiny jewelry adorns their fingers and necks. Their aim is to exude mature femininity, sprinkled with a bit of mystery. They want to smell like cinnamon and to have velvety, soft voices. Let them. Maybe Goran can be of assistance. I couldn't care less. At night, though, he'll snuggle close to me and say, "Orchid, open up." And I open up. Thank you, Andrew. If he disappears, I've kidnapped him, just so that you know. Anyway, thank you. This was amazing, Andrew. I am fascinated, and I want to hire you forever. So, all right. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Sean, so much. Thank you for the community church. Also to you guys who came, and thank you, Steve, for bringing me here. That was great. Thank you.